Live show, and I today have somebody I've been dying to talk to for quite some time. Spencer Klavan, how you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great, Jack. It's great to finally meet you in person, or at least digitally.
Exactly, exactly. We've been talking for a little bit, and I see we've got a lot of things in common, a lot of areas of overlap and interest, associates in common, overlapping networks. And so I am ready to get into this. Spencer Klavan is, what do you call it? The owner, the proprietor of the Young Heretics, the
The
associate
supreme
editor at American
overlord,
Mind,
actually, the
affiliated
governing
with the
master of the universe. Yeah.
Claremont Institute, and doing a tremendous job. So I'm having a little bit of technical weirdness right now. Spencer, let's
Yes.
just talk about your background a little bit because I don't really know you that well, and I don't know that many guys in my audience know you very well. So, how did you get to this point right now? You're the associate editor of American Mind. You've got your show, where you basically are teaching people about philosophy and beard trimming and working out, all kinds of stuff. And I just want to use this as a chance to kind of get to know you a little bit before we dig into some of the details because we got some really heavy stuff to talk about today.
Sure thing. Yeah, it's a bit of a strange journey. It's kind of roundabout. Um, I grew up kind of with the classic nerd upbringing. That really kind of all starts in seventh grade when I got forced to take a little Latin. And everybody had to take Latin at my school. I was lucky in that way that I was actually kind of shepherded through the traditional form of education that I'm now sort of out here advocating. And there was immediately for me, there was this magnetism to these ancient texts. I've always been just riveted by the idea that there could be this brotherhood of man across, thousands of years, 3,000, 10, 4,000, 5,000 years in some cases. And that followed me all my life. And the kind of natural thing to do, if that's the way that you engage with the world, is to go to grad school. And that's what I did. I had a wonderful time in Oxford doing my PhD, essentially 5 years of wandering through the fields. It was like Wordsworthian, reading Homer and contemplating the deep truths. But really, at the same time that was happening, and because I was inside the academy, I was able to observe stuff that we're now seeing all over the country. I mean, in summer of 2020, I feel like what happened is that this like dam burst, and all of this nasty stuff that had been incubating in the academy just burst out onto the streets. And that's what we saw with things like the Black Lives Matter riots. We at Claremont, where I work, we call them the 1619 riots, because really we do believe that when the New York Times publishes a massive glossy story about how Americans are either villains or victims, they're one or the other. And when you teach people that in school, eventually you get riots in the streets. And that's, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who authored that sort of cover essay, was very open and explicit about it. She was happy to be credited for the riots that summer. And I was
Yeah.
living in LA at the time, and so I watched it happen. But so I was seeing this going on already. I mean, Yale, my alma mater, where I was an undergraduate, was the site of one of the most famous, early rumblings of this. That 2015 video where the students gathered around Nicholas Christakis
Yeah.
because his wife had suggested that you should be, it's an American university, we live in America, we should be able to wear whatever Halloween costume we want, right? And that video of them just shrieking at him, that was brewing, this cultural Marxism, this turn to cancel culture, the turn toward illiberalism. All of this stuff was going on, and there came a time when it became clear to me that the kind of scholarship I wanted to do, that was sort of unapologetic, full-throated endorsement of the West. I love the West. I love the cultural products of Athens and Jerusalem. I don't think they're the property of eggheads like me. I think they're the property of everybody. And I think that what they really amount to is food for the soul. And that's what's so starving. And so after grad school, I kind of left the academy, and I instead came to work at Claremont, which is a, highly, I think, intellectually respectable institution, but it's not, it's also critical, like me, of our establishment elites. Um, And Young Heretics, which is my podcast, arose kind of naturally out of all of this, it, in the sense that people were sort of saying I was writing, I was doing things out and about, and I was kind of making a career for myself as a what you might call a public intellectual, although that always sounds so pompous,
Doesn't it though?
But it's like a super jerk. It is an annoying thing to say that you
But
are,
I'm a public
but
figure.
yeah, I'm an influencer. Yeah, that's right. But well, maybe you've experienced this. It's like when you are a public figure or an influencer or whatever, the first thing that anybody says when they meet you is you should start a podcast. And because that's like the thing, right? Is everybody has to have a podcast. And my feeling was like, what would everybody has like? What do I have to talk about that somebody isn't already talking about? I felt like there was already, the space was so full. And so I said, all right, well, if I'm going to start a podcast, I'm going to sort of talk about what I want to talk about. And that's just, I have like 5 listeners. Nobody will listen because it's going to be about Homer and Plato and the Bible and all of the great tradition that has emerged out of that. And I genuinely was just sort of like, well, I'll do this as a side project. It'll be a labor of love. And almost immediately, what I found is this enormous hunger out there just for the good stuff. It's like, it's so weird to me that that's true, except that the more this craziness goes on, the more the kind of BLM stuff snowballs, the more the critical race theory stuff gets out of hand, the more they cancel. I mean, Princeton University, ostensibly one of the best institutions of higher learning in the country, just canceled its requirement that classic students read Greek and Latin. That's what classics is reading Greek and Latin. So they basically, they're eating themselves alive. And so people have nowhere to go for this stuff. And so when somebody like me just grabs a mic and says, I'm going to rant for an hour at you about why you need to read Dante, or I'm going to tell you about why, these classical virtues like, courage and temperance, these things are, not just kind of academic subjects, but essential parts about how to be a human being, how to wake up in the morning, go about do stuff. That's not innovative. I didn't invent that. I just am the only one of the only people out there just giving it to people. And so, it's sad that that's the state we're in, but it also brings me great joy to hear from people about, I'm on my tractor and I'm listening to you talk about Aristotle or whatever. Yeah. So that's kind of how I got here.
That's incredible. That's incredible. And yes, it is true that to look towards the classics and to Lindy things is actually sort of being out there on the fringe right now. Right. And we're seeing a very overt attempt by the Blue Church or Cathedral or whomever you want to call them to extinguish these books once and for all. Get the white men out of our canon, take down the statues, get rid of the language. I mean, I think personally, from reading classics, the limited that I have, I'm trying to keep up. There's a lot, by the way.
There are a lot of books out there.
There's a lot of books out there. And in my experience of trying to uncover this stuff, it's like the answers are in the ancient texts, the answers for today. And so that's probably why they want to get rid of them. And that's why they want to make it so that we don't have any access to it. And what I find about really fascinating about your background and your experience is that you are classically trained in the cathedral, in the Blue Church. It doesn't get any more steeped in all of the establishment than you can get. But you came into it likely with a different perspective. You came into it probably like prophylactically safe against getting corrupted and wokeified while you're there. Is that right? I'm making a guess here, right? Like, did you go to these institutions knowing where you wanted to end up one day? Or was there something about your experience there that made you realize we need to go back and really hammer on this stuff? Or how did that work?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because one of the weird things, in the Iliad, which is one of the first things I covered on the show. It's, sort of the origin in a lot of ways of certainly of ancient Greek literature and one of the great foundation stones of Western literature. Greater Ajax, who's like this giant dude. He's, people in that era were already mythically huge, and Ajax is a big one. And he's so big that he strides from ship to ship, like he walks across the decks of the ship, of these different ships, the giant Greek fleet, and he's striding across them. I kind of think of my education like that, except that the ships were sinking. It was like each thing that I touched on. I left Yale in 2014. In 2015, that video came out, and then and so I always want to be careful to make clear that I had nothing but a great time at these institutes. I mean, and there are still, and there will probably, until there's an actual like great purge, until we're genuinely in hot gulag summer and people are getting carted off to the camps, right? That there's still going to be people doing good work in these institutions because there's funding for it and there's a tradition of it and all this stuff. And so you can pick your way, like I did, through Yale had a great books program, all this stuff. Um, and I do think I was to some extent inoculated against like woke brainwashing because I grew up in what you might call a mixed household. My dad's a conservative, my mom's a liberal, and so I heard those conversations at the dinner table, and I was aware that neither of those positions, as typically understood in American life, is evil. Right? It's not evil to be a conservative. It's not evil to be kind of classical liberal, and so I think in that regard, yeah, I went in with a certain degree of defense against it. But when the Princeton thing happened, it suddenly occurred something that should have been obvious to me, but wasn't. Suddenly occurred to me, which was, these organizations were founded, many of them, as seminaries. That is to teach priests how to be priests. I mean, it's one of the origin of the medieval university is clerical training, and the structure of them is that they are funded by the wealthy and powerful in this country. And when this country was founded, the elite class was a kind of Puritan, religious Christian leadership. And now our elite class is converting to this blue church, like you're saying. It's a different religion, and it's a religion of racial guilt and grievance. It's a religion of extreme gender confusion, which boils down ultimately to hatred of the human, to disgust with what it is to be a human being. And those things are articles of faith, just as much as the Trinity is an article of faith, except unlike the Trinity, which is good, the woke creed is evil. And so in some ways, unfortunately, it's kind of natural for these institutions to turn into indoctrination camps for this new creed. It's terribly sad, of course, but we all have to remember, I think, that like Socrates was executed by the state, right? I mean, the Athenians actually sent him to his death for preaching against the gods of the city and for corrupting the youth. And so this is nothing new. We and I guess that I have always had, even as a kid growing up, that tragic sense of life that like the truth has no place to lay its head. And I think for most of all, when these universities started to go insane, that helped me, I think, to understand it, is just that sense that like this is kind of the way of the world in some way.
Not a super uplifting notion right there. But I want
No.
to go back to the one thing that you mentioned. And guys, pardon me, I have been sick all week. I've been canceling appearances, but I have not canceled this one. So pardon me if I do cough or do cold schnooky sounds into a $500 pro level microphone that gets blasted straight into your ears all over the world. I apologize for that, guys. I will try to hit mute as often as possible. But the thing about the Princeton event, the Halloween thing in 2015, I had a chance to interact directly with Nicholas. I can't pronounce his last name, the professor, and it was on a thread about why do people vote for Trump. And I responded to him and I said, man, I voted for Trump to protect people like you, man. And he didn't get it. And he's like, I don't want it. And I don't care. And I don't want Trump's help. And all these terrible things are happening. And I can see all these things happening. And I just don't care. I just didn't care to vote for someone who was going to take that on. And that deflated me for a minute, where it's like, this guy was wronged. There's a systemic wronging happening. And I was like, I see this that happened to you and I'm trying to help you. And he's like, yeah, don't forget it. Some people are beyond being saved. But you mentioned your mixed household, liberal and conservative. correct. Tell me your religious background. Is it mixed as well? I mean, there's like a sort of a unique story there, isn't there?
Oh yeah. Well, it's I mean, mixed is even a generous term for my religious upbringing. I think people who are watching this may know my dad, Andrew Klavan, and so he had a public presence long before I did. He's very well known, and so he went through a pretty public conversion. And when I say it was public, he wrote a memoir about it, The Great Good Thing. Um, but that was the fruit of years and years of reflection. And people often assume that that must have had this big bearing on my upbringing, and have affected me greatly. And your father's life affects you. There's no getting around that. But my dad is actually a very, very private person. And so weirdly, while that conversion was going on, I hardly knew about it. I think I have one word in his memoir as a line, and I think it's something like, great, cool, like what, like, I think he told us he was getting baptized, and it was just sort of a whatever thing. And at the same time as that was going on, I was having a number of, so we were raised like purely agnostic. I was,
Okay,
as
very
far
good.
as I knew, I was the son of a lapsed Jew and a lapsed Catholic. That was what I understood my parents to be growing up.
Dude, that's
And
exactly my life. Exactly.
I did not know that.
My real full name is John Murphy Goldman.
There. Oh, wow.
Half
Okay.
Irish Catholic, half Ashkenazi Jew.
And so were you raised, I mean, there was nothing, we were no religious instruction in my family. Same with you?
No, I mean they made me go to Hebrew school and I was bar mitzvahed, but it was like half-assed. They sent me when I was like 11 and a half. They were like, hurry up, you got to get this done in a year and a half. And once I got the bar mitzvah done, that was pretty much it. And occasional trips to Christmas mass or Easter Sunday. But other than that, no, it was like they had let it go, and there was no place for religion in the home that I remember at all.
Yeah. I mean, my dad had a similar bar mitzvah in the sense of like, it was kind of obligatory. It wasn't religious. It was more cultural. And to the extent that a bar mitzvah can be not religious, like his was, I think. And so, yeah, we were very proud of, I mean, talk about classical liberalism. We were very proud in my family of the ability that we were given to choose our own path. And I think now looking back on that, and if I ever raise kids, like that's not what I would do, in part because one of the great lies of extreme liberalism, that is just liberalism without anything else surrounding it. One of the great lies of it is that no intervention is neutral, that if you take your hands off, then you're not doing anything to a child or to the market or to the public square. And of course, that's intervention too. You can't escape in a child's life sending some message, sending some idea about the good. And so we were taught that the highest good was freedom, was just complete freedom of thought. I would probably want to raise a kid with a tradition so that he can know what he's rejecting, even if he rejects it.
Mhm.
But that's that's kind of a tangent. I mean, we're
You're
always free to go.
you're a Christian.
I am a Christian. Yeah, yeah.
How
And
did you get there?
well, when I
I'm
was
curious because, dude, I'm on a journey, man. I'm on a
okay,
search. I'm waiting for an epiphany. I don't even know how it works, but I'm like
yeah,
hungry and open. And like, so these experiences that you've had, I'm interested. And I know a lot of people are. I can feel the energy out there. People are
yeah,
looking. They are
yeah,
people have gone from being atheist and disdainful of folks of religion and tradition to now neutral to now curious, and now I'm
yeah.
past curious into like compelled a little. So
Well, you know what? I think it has a lot to do with what you were just saying about the Christakis, the interaction you had with Nicholas Christakis, where like all of these like classical liberals, that Harper's letter were so worried about cancel culture, but then they just slapped away the hands of the Trumpists because they
right.
just couldn't bear it. And I think like the resources of secular liberalism are proving themselves super inadequate. Like that's one of the
Mhm.
reasons why people are like, there has to be something deeper to ground this in. Okay, well, since you're on a journey, I will tell you my whole story. And this is
Do
like,
it.
I don't think I've ever told this in public. Like, so
Good. Thank you.
I from as long back as I can remember, I believed in God. Like as soon as I knew there was a question, is there a God or is there not a God? I had like an instinctive answer to it. And the reason for that was just my experience of the world. Like in natural beauty, I saw more than just physical stuff. I felt kind of presence. I was wrong when I said that I have only one line in my dad's memoir, because there's another line that he remembers that when I was very, very little, I went outside and I thanked the sun for shining on me. And I guess I had that like just kind of intuition. And when you talk about energy, right, so this comes to people in different ways. Some people, it's very intellectual. It's like, well, there has to be, just logically, there has to be a highest. If there are good things, there has to be highest good. For me, it was very deep-seated emotional youth experience. And I was a very, very nerdy kid, as I mentioned. I did not react to things by reaching out to people. I reacted to things by reaching out to books. And so my version of, as I got older, I started to think like, I should know what it means. Like, what is it? What do I mean that I believe in God? What do I mean that there's this presence? What is that about? And I think maybe a lot of people would then call a pastor or talk to an imam or whatever. And that's a very good way of dealing with that. It wasn't my way. My way was to read. And so from the ages of 14 to 16, I read every religious text that I could get my hands on. I read the whole Bible, Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament. I read the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, the Tao Te Ching. I mean, in translation at this point still, but I was, really trying to understand what was going on. And my experience of this was twofold. One, I was fascinated by all of them. I'm still fascinated by all of those texts. I come back to them all the time. And I believe in what you might call indiscriminate grace, which is the idea that every culture has had, the mind of man is shaped in such a way as to see truth. And so there are truths in all of those books, I believe. However, reading the Bible felt like coming home. And that's the only way I can describe it. When I say that I had experienced a character in the universe, I mean that when I met this inscrutable, powerful, jealous, intense, and passionately adoring, loving God that first establishes a relationship with the Hebrew nation and then reveals himself in the person of Jesus Christ. I was like, that's the guy. That's my dude, And I knew him. And so I was having that experience all the while I was realizing that I was gay. And that was happening at the same time during those same 2 years. And man, I had no idea what to do about that. Like zero clue where I was going to go, who I was going to tell. And not because anybody had told me it was bad. I was growing up in Southern California. Like it was fine, socially speaking. My parents were always very open. But I felt like there was something just terribly, it was not what I imagined myself to be. It didn't fit with my ideas of masculinity. It didn't fit with what I wanted to be. And so I was up at late at night, and I had developed this habit of opening the Bible for guidance. And when I felt this way, and I was like at a dead end. I just had no way of going forward. And so I opened my Bible, which was it's the Gideon's Bible, those crappy ones that they put in hotel rooms, right? And in the beginning of that copy of the Bible, they have John 3:16 in like every language. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that he should live and die as one of us. That all who believe in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. And I was a language nerd. So I was just like kind of reading absentmindedly, like all of these different ways of saying this in French and Hebrew and Greek, whatever. And suddenly I had what I can only describe as my first conscious mystical experience, where it was like the small w words weren't there anymore, and it was just the capital W word. Like it was just the meaning of it was standing in the room with me. And it remains an ongoing and complicated thing in my life to explain to people, because of course, like the homosexuality thing and the church thing, some people feel that that's completely unacceptable. Some people don't have a problem with it. And what I try to stress to people is that in that moment, I didn't get any answers about that question. All I got was mercy and the person of God with me as I was. And I was left to basically figure things out from there. So the first thing I did was get baptized. But this is what I always tell people when they're on a journey, when they're questioning, is like, you think that you have to figure it out and then come to God. But in fact, you have to come to God, and then he will figure it, like he already has it figured out. And so I tell people a lot, like, go on, do a trial run, like pray to God about not believing in him. Like all of this stuff seems very, we have this addiction in the modern West to like arguing our way to figuring everything out. And like, that's actually not how reason works. Like reason needs material. It needs some bedrock of truth to be working with first, and then to reason from there. And so, yeah, I tell you that story only in the hopes that it will be helpful to you on your journey, which I'm interested in. Like, I'd love to hear more about it, but that's how I got there.
I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that with me and with everybody else. I have taken the approach at this point to just sort of fake it, I guess. As you said, just sort of try it out. I feel like reason gets me to an obvious answer that there must be God, right? Like it's just too big. It's just too big. All of it's just too big. Right. I mean, that's my right. Bottom line. It's like, it's all just too big. And when the universe is inside what universe is inside what universe, it's like, come on, it's just too big. Right. It's just too big.
Right.
But how do I get from being like a deist to like being a Christian? This is the part that I'm not exactly sure about. And and one of the reasons that I'm so interested in it is because I feel personally the lack of meaning, the greater meaning in our country. And I have seen it in my own life, in my own behavior, and in my own hedonism, and my own selfishness, and just pure pleasure seeking and status seeking, things like this lack of meaning. I have been with the same woman now for 7 years, and we just got engaged last week. And one of the reasons that we wanted to do it is because we wanted to come together with God, the three of us, and we wanted to create something that was bigger than both of us. And for us, that was like a baby step, I think, towards sort of understanding the full picture. I'm really just putting one foot in front of the other because I feel personally the absence, and I can see the absence in our culture, and I can see where that absence in our culture is taking us. And as a here we go again, as a public figure,
right.
You know, there's some responsibilities that come along with that. And I don't want to be an empty talker. You know, I walk the walk in every way. And this journey has been public, you know, for other people to observe. And I don't know, man, I want it for me, and I want it for our country, because without it, I think I can survive on my own, because I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but the country itself in aggregate cannot, I don't think.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to hear your, I mean, dude, we could go so many places from these comments here, but I am curious to hear your educational context for understanding the relevance and power of Christianity within the United States, and whether or not it would have existed without it. Can it exist without it now? Is there a future without it? You know, tell me your thoughts on that. I imagine we could go for 10 hours on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, congratulations. I saw you got engaged, and I was waiting until this moment to tell you in person. That's fantastic.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And one of the things my dad always taught me, even before he was religious, was like, they'd been living together forever. They were these sort of secular liberals at the time. They were both liberals at the time. And he was like, I didn't think it was going to make any difference. The minute I walked into the men's room, like after the ceremony, everything was different. Like, so that's to me, like the transparency that you're modeling with like, I don't know why I need to do this. I just, like, there's something in this purely secular account of myself and what this relationship is that doesn't satisfy, right? Like, that's going to be way more powerful than me going out and being like, here's the Nicene Creed. You have to believe this, this, and this. Like this, you know, like this, the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, immaculately born. Like, Christians do this all the time. I do it all the time of like, oh, it's time. You go into evangelism mode. And like somebody who is just trying to figure out whether there's a God, you suddenly like drop in their lap this 5,000 page book that was like written by Pope Gregory or something, you know? And like, people don't understand how far gone we are in this country. I think it's like that if you're coming at somebody trying to get them to like subscribe to creedal Christianity, like you have to understand that we are like really on thin ice with this stuff at all, where people are wondering whether there's anything besides matter. And so I think you really do, you have to take that first step first. And one of the characteristics of God that I discovered in that room that night when I didn't know what to do is like, God's here where you are. Like he's on this journey with you and not on some like imaginary journey where Jack already has it all figured out. Right. And like, this is where at a national level, this is true as well. Right. Like God doesn't break his promises. He doesn't abandon people because they sin. He calls them to repentance. And we are being called as a nation to realize that this materialism stuff does not make sense. The question about America's history, right, is actually to me really fascinating as a scholar of antiquity and of the ancient world, because one of the things I try to bring out on Young Heretics a lot is like people make these terrible intellectual mistakes. I think like David Hume is an example of a philosopher who makes terrible intellectual mistakes, but like
Listen to that one.
they do them for a reason, right? They make these mistakes because they're living in a time and place, and the world looks a certain way to them. And one of the things that happened in the 18th century is that, you know, Newtonian physics totally reframed everybody's understanding about how the world works, including like, well, there are these forces at play that we can't even see. And also it seems as if the universe kind of works like a machine, right? And for a while, it started to seem persuasive to people that that's all there is. It's just these, like you can, Stephen Hawking, the supposedly brilliant physicist, wrote an essay in, I think, the Wall Street Journal that you don't need God to create the universe. You just need some laws, right? You just need some rules. You sort of think about it, it's like, well, whose rules, right? Who wrote the laws? But at the time, right, these things seemed very intuitive. And one of the interesting things about Hume is that he points back to Epicurus, who's an ancient philosopher who came of age at exactly the same kind of moment when the physical laws of the universe were being discovered. And he posited things like multiverse theory that you said that just now, right? Like the universe within the universe, just to get away from the idea that there might be this sort of rational order to things that suggests a rational mind. And so we go through these periods in history, but, you know, I do not think that our founders believed in that materialism. I think that some of them were devout Christians. Some of them were kind of more theist, you might say, more just a baseline, there is a God. And it's been sort of suggested that Thomas Jefferson was a total atheist or that he was a kind of naturalist about things. I think it's a more complicated story than that. But one of the fascinating things, again, is that John Adams writes a letter to his friend in which he says, all of our philosophers are just Epicureans now. It's just Epicurus all the way down. And these things, they come back because, you know, we go through these periods of thinking, well, the human mind can discover so much, right? And the natural world is so orderly that we don't need God, right? And then, of course, as Israel did, as any number of nations has done, you kind of go down that path for a while. And where does it lead you? It leads you to pure power politics always, because as G.K. Chesterton tells you, right, when there is no God, you worship the most powerful thing on earth. What's the most powerful thing on earth? It's the state. And so, like, the question, how is that working out for you, is actually a really important question to ask. And academic philosophy, like, hates to ask this question because it seems too basic or too, you know, like, we have to be making these complicated arguments. But, like, how is it working out for you to be a blue-haired leftist that riots in the streets and, like, you know, chemically castrates children? Like, how is that working out? And to me, Jesus says, you shall know them by their fruits. Like, the proof is in the pudding. And I definitely think that, like, we are at a place right now where we go one of two ways. And the way that you're going is kind of, to me, the way forward, where it's like, I don't, you know, we've kind of moved away from our ancestral faith. Obviously, it was, creedal Christians who founded this country, not just the founders, but the Puritans, right, the Pilgrims. That's in deep, deep decay. And the first thing is not for us all to like immediately. I would love for us all to convert to Christianity. I would. I think that would be great. I think everybody would be happier. But I also think that the church needs to do a better job of saying, all right, let's just start here. Let's start with God, and let's start with how is it working out for you to look at the world as if it were just flesh, as if it were just atoms bouncing off of each other. It's not working out very well.
It's not. It's not. But then, by what metrics? That's a tough one to judge. But I feel like if you just sense the trends and the energy is dissipating. It's becoming more chaotic and less orderly. Pardon me. Told you guys I was sick, but I'm pushing through. It's becoming more chaotic and less orderly, which I think would be a symptom of, quote, it's not really working out for you. And it takes, what does it take to make a woke person wake up, right? It takes like some serious personal tragedy, I think. In my experience, some sort of heavy personal trauma, some sort of something that forces them to detach from their ego invested narratives and ideas and framework for the world, and then be vulnerable enough and open enough to and frankly desperate enough to receive a new message, and then be humble enough to see whether or not that new message can lead you to someplace positive, and then courageous enough to take the steps on that path. How does that happen on a national level? This is the issue that I think really needs to be discussed, because we can throw sand in all the gears, we can pass laws, we can run info ops and troll people and do meme wars and whatever, educate our own side. But like, how do we break that mind virus out in a way that doesn't kill the people and creates that environment in which you can have courage and humility and vulnerability in order to take a step forward on a new path?
Yeah, well, that personal catastrophe thing is really chilling, because I think you're kind of right, and it's also kind of biblical. I mean, when you say by what metric, right, are things not working out? The standard sort of pro materialist, pro scientific revolution answer would be, well, maybe you, like dogmatic crazy person, think that people's souls are in danger or whatever nonsense. But look at the iPhone, look at penicillin, look at all of these amazing advancements that we've made in our physical material comforts. And isn't the world better when people have money, when the middle class can buy an iPhone? On and on and on. And my answer to that is COVID. My answer to that is like, even in material terms, our philosophy is wrong, and that is causing us terrible harm. So even when we try to use all of our technology to like scourge death from the earth, the reason that doesn't work is because we don't know like philosophy 101. We don't know theology 101 that says like there's always risk, there's always death. And so we chase our tails in these terrible circles where it's like we have to shut down the whole world because of this one disease. But now here's this vaccine that cures the disease, but we have to shut down the whole vaccine because of 6 blood clots, right? I mean, we go into these terrible death spirals, essentially, on the very points that we're supposed to have given up everything else for. We're supposed to have given up everything else just so that we could be safe, secure, fat, and happy. And we're not. We're getting less of those things, all of those things, right? C.S. Lewis, whom I love, this great Christian apologist, says, aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you will get neither. And it's that, right? So then you do come up against this, like, does it require a catastrophe? And you would like, the problem is that the minute you start saying this, it sounds like you're wishing things on people, right? It sounds like you're like wishing that terrible things would happen to some woke person so they would be vulnerable, whatever, wishing that the nation would go through this terrible catastrophe. That's not it at all. It's just that, this is a biblical thing and a pattern. And when the Bible describes these patterns over and over again, people think this is like magical voodoo. It's not. It's just political science, right? It's just political philosophy. And there's an amazing passage in, I believe it's Ezekiel, in which God says to Israel, I'm going to rain hellfire down on, because you've turned away from me, I'm going to rain hellfire down on you, and I'm going to topple your buildings and destroy your nation and send you out into the desert, and there I will plead with you. And it gets to this, it's this whole crescendo of all the punishments of God, which, it oftentimes in the Bible, what looks like, the punishments of God is really just consequences, right? It's really just, you've chosen this path and this is where this leads. And so your nation falls apart. But why? Why? Well, so that God can plead with you, so that you will be stripped of all your pretensions, stripped of all your illusions, all of this stuff. Now, that is no fun. It is just not fun to go through that. And I would very much like for America to have that kind of realization without suffering catastrophe. I still believe that this country is beautiful. I believe the world would be much worse off if it were conquered or whatever, driven into exile like Babylon. And I'm starting to get this feeling like there is a way for that to happen, in the sense that, and I wrote about this recently, like there are these kind of two worlds playing simultaneously right now in America. One of which is an old world that is going to come crashing around our ears. And that's the sort of like Joe Biden G7 summit, like globalist Klaus Schwab, Davoisie world. That world seems to me to be like thoroughly out of ideas. And the way I can tell is because they're hosting people at their universities that like fantasize about killing white people. This is Yale Medical School just had this. And like, yeah, I think that there's going to be some, if present trends continue, it's hard not to predict that there will be something shocking and cataclysmic that changes the course of that world, because you can't go on with no ideas for too long. At the same time, right, like the American people are amazing, and they are still in red states, in group chats, in like Bitcoin hubs, which I don't understand at all, but which are going on. Like there's this enormous energy right now that I almost think could kind of could carry on and take the mantle after that old world crumbles. But, it's a fool's game to look into the future. That's just my hope.
Well, we're working on building the future in the liminal order. We've already understood that the institutions are totally captured and the narratives are bunk, and they're going to kill you if you listen to what they say. So we're creating our own narratives, and we're creating our own networks to replace those institutions. But I want to go back to, that's liminal-order.com, guys. Check it out. I want to go back to something you said about perfectibility. It seems as though we're dealing with people who believe that everything can be perfect. And the absence of perfection is, I don't know, the worst possible thing, evil. And we must strive in every which way to perfect everything and discard morals, values, and virtues and everything all along the way towards achieving this perfection. Whereas I believe that the people that I associate with and talk to and get along with kind of all accept that things are imperfect, including ourselves. And that there's evil in the world and bad things happen and it's never going to be perfect and good enough is okay. And this is it seems like maybe to the unexamined, it could seem not that important of a distinction. But to me, it feels like perhaps the ultimate distinction. And do you get that sense? Do you see that? I mean, am I crazy?
100%. Okay. Oh, no, you're definitely not crazy. I mean, this is a great example of how basic the questions are that we are having to wrestle with now. It's not like, is everybody going to suddenly accept Christianity into their hearts? It's like, are people going to believe in a God? And are people going to accept this like first, it's like the first premise of all sane cultural life is that the world is a veil of sorrows, right? I mean, and after that, you can get to a lot of great, amazing stuff, right? After you take that black pill, there's just an incredible universe of grace and joy, and within that, possibility. But this is not, I mean, the Christian teaching on this is about the fall, right? This is the Christian idea of original sin. And that is one of the central doctrines of the church. That's my account of why everything is a little bit broken. But this is not unique to Christianity. Like the idea that things are not as they should be can be found everywhere. I mean, the Buddhist idea that existence is suffering and we must, and therefore the solution is detachment. The Stoic idea, right, which is very similar, that we have to kind of let our stand at a remove from our fleshly desires and our ideas about what's good and bad. Obviously, the Jewish idea that God is working himself out through history, but we, in our distance from him and in our going astray, right? All of these are answers or explanations or descriptions even of just like, it's not perfect and it's probably never going to be perfect. And I definitely think that once you can say that, you're living in reality. Like when you talk about liminal order, which I do think is a great example of what I mean when I'm talking about the new world, when I'm talking about people just sort of saying, well, our institutions are broken, we're going to have to do this for ourselves or get, completely hammered. That when you're talking about that, you're talking about people who are living in reality. And when I see the COVID stuff, when I see people, locking themselves in their rooms for a whole year or more. I see people who are, it's very tragic to me, people who have not been taught what reality is. And once again, it's not just like, oh, these poor unchurched heathens. It's like, oh, these people that never like sociologically moved beyond infancy. Like this was a conversation that I remember having with my mother as a toddler. Like, and you have to teach these things in tradition. That's part of why the Western tradition is so important. I mean, that Latin word traditio, which is handing down these facts, these realities to people. No, I do think that that's the gateway to just living in the real world.
I think that this is part of the reason why the conflict that we face today feels different. It is not a debate over marginal tax rates. It's not a debate really over antitrust law. I mean, it's even not even really a debate over immigration. I mean, it is to some degree, but you know what? It's really these are fundamentally philosophically incompatible worldviews, starting with the very first premise of each. That seems irreconcilable to me.
Right. Well, I mean, we did just publish at the American Mind this whole set of pieces about like something that's kind of been on people's minds, the idea of secession, right? Like, is this another 1860? Are we two Americas to such an extent that we just can't agree? And I mean, I'm with you that we are fighting over first principles. I think that's true. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it was one of those famous like David French moments online where somebody said like, it was my buddy, Michael Knowles said, you're not going to get the kids excited about whatever it was, licensing reform, I think, and that stuff you're talking about, the marginal tax rates, the Reagan era bumper stickers, which were good. Like I always sound like I'm just like I hate Reagan or Buckley, and I don't. I don't hate either of them. I think they were great men in their time who responded to the needs of their era, but they were different. I mean, then the existential conflict was outside of America. That was how are we going to live within America as a strong nation that faces outward against this Soviet threat, right? And this is something that you could also draw from ancient wisdom, and it would be what a Christian would call idolatry, that truths that are real and complicated and urgent in the moment, they get recycled and repackaged into bumper stickers. And then people just trot them out, right? Licensing reform, like small government, limited government, and all of these things, which, they may be good. They're just answers to the wrong questions now, because now we're in this totally different universe. And so I don't hate whatever establishment conservatism. I just think it's like bumper sticker answers to questions that are now 50 years old. And the questions we are asking are much more fundamental and much more internal. So can we resolve those without coming apart at the seams? Like, I think there are some good proposals on the table, and I think these proposals are going to become more plausible going forward, because the kind of stuff that you're describing doesn't go away. Like, you don't just sort of, oh, yesterday we were talking about whether there's such a thing as male and female, and today we just decided it doesn't matter very much. Like, that's not how this sort of thing works. And so more and more, you're going to see these proposals like the one in Idaho and Oregon to kind of shave some counties off and put them into Idaho, so that these rural red counties can get out from under the heel of these progressive city governments. I think that's a great idea. I would love to see more of that. And there's a possibility that that would let us cool our jets, would let us resolve, and would let some of this progressive madness kind of work itself out to its logical conclusion, and people within those communities would catch wise. Because people do, I mean, eventually stuff gets bad enough, people catch wise. You don't meet a lot of refugees from communist countries who are like, well, yeah, that was great under Chavez. Like, I loved that. That was really what I wanted. And so, there's a possibility, I think, for letting off some gas if we get serious about it now. But I and I hate this, because it's so bad when secession is on the table, when civil war is on the table. But I definitely think that you're onto something when you say that, like, these questions are so existential that they are at least of the type which could generate that sort of thing. And that's no fun. That's no good place to be.
The openness of our society has allowed this to percolate up, interestingly enough. And the fact that we didn't institutionalize like these, I mean, we did institutionalize these values in the church and in other institutions, and yet they're failing us, or they've been diminished, or, I don't go to church, so I can't talk trash about it, but people reflect to me that they're not getting what they want, generally speaking, loosely speaking, when describing the church in general, whatever that may mean. And they've been diminished, and they've been culturally and socially mocked and diminished. And the guardrails that we had in place to guide us are gone. And we're like on a 1-lane road at the top of the mountain range, and we're just like, it's too narrow for the car.
Yeah.
And we're gonna go over one edge or the other. I was looking back on some of my undergrad studies. I had this amazing professor, Dr. David Williams, at George Mason University, and he taught me American literature through Moby Dick and through antinomians and the conflict of the religious types and not. And we went back all the way and read all the precursors into Moby Dick, and then read Moby Dick with that really great context. And one of the things that we read is a collection of sermons from rural pastors in pre-revolutionary times, in like the 1860s, 1850s, 1840s. And man, those folks believed that they were creating a new Zion, and that they were creating God's country, and they were chosen and blessed, and they were on a religious journey. And it was the union between those folks and the cosmopolitan lawyer philosopher types who wanted to see their fancy experiment get put into practice, right? I'm not mocking them, but it was definitely an intellectual exercise as much as it was a nation building exercise, right? And then they had to unite with and join forces with, very, very devout religious folks who believed they were building a new nation, and they were Zionists. And so it's built into our revolution. It's built into the fabric of our country. But it has been diminished and diminished and diminished to the point now where, like, if you want to be religious, it's kind of even hard to figure it out. It's kind of hard to figure it out.
I mean, it's an extremely curious thing what you're describing. The pilgrims, as William Bradford wrote, they knew they were pilgrims. King James said, "I will harry these people out of England." Right? I mean, they were a persecuted minority, and no joke about it. They had to flee their home country, and yet they were. The thing that they were trying to do was return to a sort of more spare, strict, and devoted form of Christianity. And so there has always been this kind of double reality that people come to this continent to be free of persecution, to be allowed to live their lives as they choose. But more often than not, the people who were doing that were choosing to live their lives in a stricter and more religious and more devout way. This,
Right.
they were a people ready for freedom, in large part because they had been trained by the great traditions of Britain, right, and of England. And they, when we rebelled, we demanded our rights as Englishmen. I mean, this is a famous story about the American Revolution, that it's underwritten by Blackstone and all of the great English jurists, and even back to Magna Carta. I mean, this is a long history that trains a people to use their freedom and their liberty wisely. And I think that's why John Adams writes at one point, our Constitution is written for a moral and religious people, and it is wholly unfit for the government of any other. I mean, this is another one of those bumper stickers, right? That complete personal autonomy is a good in itself. Well, it's not. It's a good because it's the context within which people make choices. And choices are the root of true morality, right? I mean, this is an Aristotelian observation, that what we do because we choose it is what we say is either good or bad. And so you let people have liberty because you believe that they have grown to a stature of sort of rational capacity and training, And this is one of the huge problems for what you're describing when you're saying it's hard to know how to move forward, it's hard to have any idea, is because we thought that the liberty was the only thing. And liberty is a good thing. I believe powerfully in it, but it's not the only thing, right? It takes place within the context of these traditions. And now when people look around and they say, well,
Keep going,
how do I use my liberty? When people look around and ask that question, it's like there are no, as you say, guardrails. There are no traditional cultural systems in place, either to raise them up or to guide them when they're adults. And so one of the most urgent tasks for us is to be forming and creating those guardrails, right? And so from the very earliest days on up, and of course this is again ancient wisdom. Plato and Aristotle both kind of look to this Greek idea of, you have gymnastics for the body, and by that they just mean every form of sort of physical education, and music for the soul. And by that, they don't just mean like playing the harp. They mean, the whole spectrum of arts that is overlooked by the muses. So history, geometry, mathematics, astronomy, all of this stuff. And eventually over many, many hundreds of years, this gets formed into the trivium and the quadrivium, right? The kind of the liberal arts that one learns. And so these things are understood in antiquity as a shaping of the soul, as molding the way that you see the world, the things you love, the things you hate. Going back to the beginning of our conversation, right? That's part of why the left wants to dismantle this, is like that is exactly what they're going after, is this idea that there's better and worse ways to be a human being. Mm. And again, thinking about this kind of double world, the new world and the old world, it's like the new world has a lot of tools for rebuilding that. What we really are is trying to get back to those ancient forms of wisdom, and to offer people more than just like, do whatever you want, right? Like it's all good, it's all whatever. Like we're trying to form some course of study so that when people like you say, well, I'm searching, I want order, I want meaning, we have this enormous resource to draw on, right? Here's what you do first. You train in this and then in that. And I think we're tasked with the project of rebuilding that, like by hand, because all of our institutions that are supposed to do it aren't. And look, I love that work. I'm excited by it, even though it's hard.
It's like intellectual archaeology. You have to like dig the dirt and clear the dirt away to find the stuff that was already written, already said, already accepted. I remember when I first interviewed Ryan Williams, and I was like, "Tell me, what does Straussian mean?" Because I just wanted to get that out there. And like, some idea that like not all things old are bad and not everything new is good, right?
Yeah.
Like this is something that's been beaten into us. At least I feel like it has been, that old things are bad, new things are good, period. QED. That's it. And frankly, that's just not the case. We've mentioned the word a couple times, masculinity. We talked about gender. I know that masculine issues are something that you hold very dear. You write a lot and talk a lot about them. I do as well. But let's just start a little bit from the beginning on masculinity and carry it into how do we reach the kids about it, right? Because addressing the old people ain't going to get us nowhere. We got to talk to the kids. They are the future. I've heard that said and sung and written many times because it is so true. Masculinity. Where does masculinity fall in this conversation? What role does it have to play in solving these problems? And then as we talk about that, the roots of it, where it's going, let's then evolve this conversation into how do we reach the kids on these
Yeah.
issues, Spencer?
Yeah. Well, this is an issue that, as you say, I mean, you and I both have been kind of obsessed is too strong a word, but we believe very strongly in the importance of this issue. I think that I had that belief reinforced over the past year when I saw the character of Americans kind of being whittled away by this soft, protective state, right? It really, to me, it was all brought into a conclusion just recently when I went to the grocery store and they've been announcing over the intercom every 5 minutes, please wear a mask to protect people from the spread of germs, whatever. And then the CDC was like, well, actually, if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask. And at that point, really, the dominoes came tumbling down, at least here in Nashville. And it's basically, nobody wears masks anymore. The pandemic is over as far as we're concerned over here. And so instead of replacing that announcement in the grocery store, or just getting rid of it entirely, they replaced it with instructions on how to cover your mouth when you sneeze. And so now every 5 minutes when you walk through the grocery store, it's like, in order to stop the spread of germs, please cover your mouth when you sneeze, or with your elbow, with your hand or with your elbow. And at that point, right, it's like you are talking to a society that has lost what the Greeks would have called thumos. And thumos is this way of getting at really the core, the chest of the soul of the person, right? And of course, when you start talking about this, everybody says, well, what about like women have this too? Yes, right. We all have, elements of both in us, whatever. But in point of fact, we are inescapably gendered. We are born not just into a certain kind of body, but that body is itself an embodied soul. And I believe that carries with it certain responsibilities. And this is a good example of something that really cuts against the grain of personal autonomy, where it's like, well, I can do anything I want to be. It's true. You can choose anything you want. You can't magically declare yourself to be a woman. That's a whole separate thing. But you can pursue any pursuit you want. You have that right, that liberty. But there are certain obligations that men, I believe, have, just as there are certain obligations that women have, and certain natural aspirations that we're born with. This is a kind of language that I think we really lack now, because we've been so hoodwinked by this idea about a social construct, that these are all just expectations that society places on us. Well, first of all, where did society get those expectations, right? Surely from people going about building these societies. And the other thing, of course, is that we are, this is natural to us. It's natural to build societies, and we build them out of our natural impulses. And yeah, no boy is born with a gun in his hand, but boys are born with an aspiration to use their strength for good. And they're born with aspirations to protect people, and these things, of course, can be directed in different ways. That's part of why education is so important. And that piece, I think, that you linked recently on Twitter that I wrote a while back called Be a Man is about the fact that these things, there is a relationship between those natural aspirations and the way that people grow up. And the relationship is that our natural self is shaped and molded by what we're taught. And these are the things that vary from culture to culture. So when leftists say, well, look, like in this culture, the men farm, and in this culture the men hunt. And it's like, yeah, but they take care of the house, right? Like this sort of these basic things that, and so, you know, your society based on your time and your place, your circumstances will teach you how to best use those natural aspirations. But what our society does is it teaches you to like contort those and turn them inward and stamp them out, right? I mean, our society hates, especially thumos, manly assertion, because it's very difficult to control, and indeed it can be dangerous. And so we've stripped away all of our traditional modes of guiding boys to grow into men. And I think like when you come to this question, right, of how do we reach the kids? To me, we have one huge advantage. The left has every other advantage. They have the institutions, they have the culture, they have the movies, they have all this stuff, right? Masculinity and femininity are attractive. They're the only really attractive things in the world. The only attractive human, the only sexy human things, the only appealing human things are you know, masculinity and femininity and the various different versions of that. And this does not mean, by the way, that every dude has to be a He-Man. Not every dude has to have a beard like Jack Murphy. Like this is, you know, this is not this kind of like, you know, iron rigid. It never was. This is another great lie, is that these roles are somehow restrictive and narrow. What the right has to get better at doing, I think, is making this stuff look cool and being a little bit less like on the defensive and afraid about it, because there's nothing less manly or appealing than a guy who feels like he's at a disadvantage telling you that you have to do, our culture will fall apart if men don't stand up and be it's like you can sense the fear, and people can, you know. I think we should be much better on the right about just like having a blast with how much more natural and fun our way of doing things is. And, you know, of course, along with that will come education and will come forms of, you know, homeschooling or charter schooling or whatever. We do need to recover things like single sex institutions, right? I mean, the Boy Scouts is crumbling from within, but something like that, right? Men's gyms, women's gyms, these, or, you know, bigger, like, you know, places where men can teach boys how to be men, places where women can teach girls how to be women. You know, we have to build those things up again. But I think one reason why those efforts sometimes fail is we don't start them from a place of like abundance. Like we are having a blast. We have the good stuff. And I think like, you know, liminal order and that kind of thing is like, it's fun. It looks good, you know, and I think that's the working out thing is another one, right? It's like, yeah, you work out because you want to look and feel amazing, and like you don't want to be 300 pounds, and like that. I think we should be just like way more fun and goofy and antic about that, because the truth is on our side, and that's a fun place to be.
Fun, you're right. Fun.
Yeah.
I was reading a piece from Anton the other day where I believe that he was citing Machiavelli and referencing Bronze Age pervert, and I think it was one of the first times I saw Michael really give Bap some due on that by connecting Machiavelli's urges to be fun and engage the youth and disregard the old folks, and connecting that to Bronze Age pervert strategy. And I think he's been really, you can't deny Bap's effectiveness when it comes to reaching the youth. And I'll tell you, I have had some incredible, including yourself, guests on this show. The Bronze Age Pervert show that I did 2 years ago is still my number one listened to podcast, number one downloaded, because he does have the attention of the youth and of the energy of the youth. Having fun and demonstrating, it's big dick energy, dude. That's what it is.
It's totally BDE, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have to,
this is what
you have to wear it and own it and swing it around and just, and with no shame.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, because you and I both, right, do a lot on Twitter of like, you know, did you work out today? Like, you know, and I've noticed something really interesting about that. Whenever you do that, whenever you tweet a gym selfie, whenever you say like, you should get jacked, you should unapologetically, and like, you know, is that I get exactly two kinds of responses. And one is by far the majority kind. And that is like, in the DMs, dude, like, you're actually inspiring me. Like, and you and I think have talked about this, how like that makes the entire thing worthwhile. And for me, a lot of times it's like nerdy guys who are like, I didn't know that you could like read a lot and also lift weights, and it's like, or you're modeling that or whatever. And so this is like, everything else is, nothing else matters when you hear that, and that's the majority. Then you get like, why are you like, you're supposed to be talking about Homer, like why are you tweeting about your biceps, like this stupid like douchey backwards hat wearing whatever. Now, first of all, I does not care, but it is interesting, right? I mean, it's interesting when you get that reaction, and you can always tell that you're touching some kind of nerve.
Yeah.
Because why should it matter to some anonymous guy on Twitter that I'm tweeting about this? Well, it matters because people know that this is important. They know that this is like, there's something indispensable about that BDE, and like letting that out a little bit, even if, it takes a certain degree, it takes a kind of like, I don't know, I think it takes a kind of leadership or something to just step out and model that. And it's not everybody's cup of tea. Some people are more reserved, but whatever. King David says, I will be yet more ridiculous than this. Like, I'll be a little like, crazy on Twitter if it gets people like off the couch and into the gym. Like, I don't know that and I think that's when you talk about BAP, when you talk about what I would call RWBB, right wing bodybuilder Twitter, Physique Friday, all of this stuff. It's like, there's a certain just animal energy, and it's like, we think of that as not civilized, but it's actually the motor of civilization. It's like that's what builds cities, societies, civilizations. And it's like, yeah, you have to harness it, you have to make it righteous, you have to put it into a marriage, you have to do all of these things. But with, you have to have it, and with it, that's the indispensable thing. And so, yeah, I think like people get mad about it because they know it's like, you got to have it.
You got to have it. And Bap gets shit because he says, and then get on a pirate ship and cruise around the world causing terror. Now, that's not exactly what he means, obviously. And, even if he does, the point is that we got to do things to spur people, right? I mean, when you look at the numbers, it is just pathetic. Testosterone count down, grip strength down, sperm mobility down, fatness up, lean muscle mass down. I mean, every element of masculinity totally been diminished and destroyed, declining into the toilet. American Psychological Association pathologizes masculinity, risk-taking, competitiveness, et cetera, et cetera. And it's funny. It's like, we're beyond even now accepting that there's a war on masculinity. Like, it took really, I mean, dude, I've been studying and working on this stuff since like 2009. And it took me, even knowing what I know and saying all the things and living it took me until the Kavanaugh hearings where I heard the language of radical feminism, at the Senate Judiciary Committee, where I was like, okay, all right, it's for real. It's for real, for real. There's no denying it. It's for real, for real, for real. And so in our parts of the internet, it's just taken for granted. But like, it's no matter how many millions of impressions I get or whatever, we're still niche level. We had this conversation, niche. We're still small sliver of the universe level.
Right.
And so our rhetoric and tactics need to, it works one way, works on people who are hungry and seeking things in the dark corners of the internet. Those things don't necessarily work on people who are just like, oh, I follow this baseball player and now I'm following Jack Murphy for some reason. And what the hell is he talking about? BDE, did you work out today? There has to be an evolution in the tactics, I believe, and some sort of fun. Right? We have to have more fun. Fun is attractive. Attractiveness is attractive. I mean, it's weird to even say that, but we really do have to focus on it. And one thing, I'm announcing to the world today, one thing that we've got coming up this summer is we are doing a tour. We're doing like an 8-city tour starting in late summer and into the fall. And we're going to host Sunday socials in various cities called Jacked Brunch. And the idea is I'm going to travel around. We're going to do some events on Saturdays, and then we're going to do a Sunday social called Jack Brunch. And the idea is just to get together and have fun, right? It's going to be on Sunday. There's going to be one teeny tiny element of like a spirituality. Did you just come from church? Great. Like maybe that much. And then fun and socializing and sun and looking good and feeling good and being around other people that look good and feel good as well. Because we got to have fun. We got to do it. And you're doing it in your own way, which I love. And I want being a nerd that lifts, right?
Yeah.
That is, the fact that those were separated
Yeah.
is the problem, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
throughout history and philosophy and antiquity, like they didn't separate training the mind and the body.
Well, this is like, so I'm in a few like group chats about lifting or whatever, and in one of them, which shall remain unnamed, one of the guys just like, I never talk about really anything but lifting in these group chats, but one of the guys was just like, dude, I just discovered this book, Plato's Republic, man. Like, it's really good. And I was like, yeah, dude, that's a great book. And the first thing that I said is like, isn't it crazy that Plato or Socrates just takes it for granted that the philosopher kings have to be jacked AF? Like,
Right.
I mean, I was talking earlier about gymnastics for the soul, or gymnastics for the body, music for the soul. I was like, those are not just like accidental. Well, you do this thing over here, this thing over here. It's like, no, these things are intimately bound up with one another, and you can't have like kooky ideas about living your truth when you're struggling to do a 1 rep max on the bench press, right? Because there's a reality there, and it's the weight, right?
Yeah.
And like, that, and that has relevance to what you're going to go away and write if you're a philosopher, or what you're going to think as you read things. And when you read somebody like David Hume, whom I mentioned that I don't really love, and it's like, well, he says the book, you drop a book 20 times, but how do you know it's going to fall the 21st time? And it's like, well, if I have to make a bet in the gym whether this like shoulder press is going to come falling down if I let it go or not, like I know what I'm betting. And so these kind of basic, like up against the hard realities of the world, there's a difference between a kind of philosophy that says, okay, here are some facts. These are complicated. Have you ever thought about this? Like, how do we reason with these facts, versus a kind of philosophy that says, well, that fact isn't really a fact, right? It's a very, very different kind of thing. And a lot of our philosophy now is like, that reality only looks to you like that reality, but actually don't believe your lion eyes. It's not a thing.
Right.
But no, I love that. I hope you'll come out to Nashville with
100%.
that tour.
100%.
Excellent. I'll see you there.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I definitely think, you were mentioning having gone through American literature earlier, and for my money, the great American novel is Huck Finn. I like have, will die on that hill or whatever. But I think one of the great things about it is that it has these little vignettes that are so they're funny, and they have caricatures in them of like rural types and aristocratic types, but they're never mean, right? It's this like enormous loving approach to America and how crazy America is in the South. And there's a scene in it where this kind of aristocratic guy is like the one rich dude in the town, and the town drunk, whose name is Boggs, is just like insulting him, just screaming obscenities at him. And the aristocrat says, I will tolerate this until 1 p.m. And this is a good example of kind of that manly assertion, right? It's like there is a line, and you go up to that line, and then once he says, if you continue this 1 minute past 1 p.m. or whenever the time is, I think it's 1, like you can't run far enough that I won't find you. And so the guy crosses the line, and he gets shot. The aristocrat shoots him, and the town gathers up into a mob and chases him to lynch him. And he just turns around and he says, the most pitiful thing in the world is a mob, because there are no men in it. And one man, is worth 20 mobs, 20 armies. And this, when you talk about being in the minority or being like kind of this lone voice, I agree. Yeah. But on the other hand, like one man, if you just like if Nicholas Christakis had known what he was up against, I don't think we knew at the time. And if he had just simply said, we do not do this here, and asserted his authority, it would have been a very different situation. I do think that like numbers here can be deceiving in that way.
Definitely. And it's a great example of how like history. I talked to my mom and I'm like, Mom, these things are happening. But she's like, it'll work itself out.
Yeah.
Okay, but who's gonna work it out, Mom? How people. Mom, actual people have to do things.
Yeah.
Me included. Here I
Right.
am again
Right.
as a as a public intellectual.
As a public, it's like,
As a
well,
public
right. But it's
intellectual.
like, you know,
But it's
but
true.
but this is interesting though. Like you have a responsibility. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
this is, I remember very vividly the first time that I got a message from somebody that said, hey, on this episode of the podcast, you said this. And then I went away and did this because you said that. And then this happened. And I swear to you, my reaction was like, what? Like you weren't supposed to do that. Like, I'm just a guy with a mic. I'm just talking, you know? And it was like, that changed my whole like career from then on. It was like, oh, on the other side of this camera are X number of people who are who are the important people, right? Who are going to go out and do the thing and build the movement and whatever. And like, they are listening to you.
Yes.
And it's like, you know, when you say it's pompous to be a public intellectual, whatever, like here we are behind the mic, right? Like, and it's amazing to me how few, this is a sign of the corruption of our elite class, is that so many people who are in that position, it never even occurs to them. Like they never even think that they're there to make people's lives better and not to scoop people's brains out with a melon baller. So I do think you're right. Like you have a responsibility to
we do
lead people.
have a responsibility, and we do have a duty. We have a duty and service. Okay.
Right.
Our three core values in the liminal order are masculinity, brotherhood, and sovereignty. And included in brotherhood, we include service. Service to each other, service to your family, service to your community, service to your nation. Service in of itself is a spiritual act. Getting out of yourself, thinking about someone else, giving a piece of yourself to them, whether it's your time, your money, your energy, hopefully your time and your energy. Money's good too, but really that personal element. Service work is not something that is stressed. I know my kids are supposed to do this like community service crap to graduate, but it's all just a game. It's like, oh, I can do this and I can do that. Oh, I get my 75 hours and that's it. The spirit of service is not implemented in people, but I feel a calling to it. I mean, dude, I'm not sure you know my whole story, but like I was just a regular guy with an anonymous Twitter account. I got doxxed and targeted by Antifa. I got fired, Nazi racist, the whole thing. Totally cast out into the wilderness, no job, no money, no reputation, no anything. And in the 3 years that that's happened, I have completely rebuilt my life and put myself into this circumstance by harnessing all that negative energy and turning it into something positive. And now I have a life that is like perfectly aligned between my personal values, my mission, my day-to-day actions. And because of that, I am like floating across a frictionless surface, man. I'm propelled through life. And I have a very strong sense of duty to spread these ideas and to be a leader, as pompous as that sounds as well. But just by taking action and being like, bro, I worked out today. Did you work out today? Why do we have to work out? Because you know what? Aesthetics matter, power matters, save the world, get in the squat rack. Do you feel a sense of duty yourself, sir? Or have you been called?
Well, I mean, yes, the short answer is yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. I mean, and I believe very firmly that every body and every man, especially, is called to something and has what the church would call a vocation. And those three things that you listed, and I think brotherhood and service is key there, because it's another place where you come up against reality, right? Where you get off the phone and you stop thinking about like the genetics that are in your way, or like whatever like bullshit excuse you have that you explain, you justify to yourself why you have to not whatever do this thing. It's like then you go out into the world and you're like, well, actually this person didn't have food and now he has it, or whatever. And there's like just a bare bones reality to it. But I wonder what you think about this, actually. I mean, when you describe, and I have read about your story of being like whatever, canceled, whatever you want to call it. I have to imagine that there's, despite the pain, it's very liberating. Oh, yeah. And I mean, I think of myself as somebody that comes pre-canceled. Like I have already said so many damning things online that anybody who books me for an event or asks me to write either knows everything that I believe or is an idiot and hasn't done their research, you know? And like, so to me, there is an incredible liberty in that. And I know that like everybody has certain advantages. Everybody does. Everybody has certain opportunities open to them. And I used to make a lot like hem and haw a lot more about that. It was like, well, I have this great job where I get to say whatever I want, and I'm not. I don't hem and haw so much about that anymore, because like I I could have like gone a different path, right? I could have shut up and tried to become a college professor at some elite institution, and then just like bowed to the meekly shuffled away. It probably would have been easier for me. I certainly would have had less like emotional stress starting it out. And so and when somebody like you, who actually did lose everything and then built it back with the sweat of your hands, right? It's like, don't come to me with your excuses. Like, it's not helpful to somebody to be like, oh, I see why you have to whatever. Like, no, like men don't do well with that it doesn't like benefit them or serve them. And at a certain point, it's like, what do you have if not your word, right? If you feel as if you cannot speak the truth, then they've taken the last thing from you. It doesn't matter what else they gave you. It doesn't matter if they gave you money. It doesn't matter if they gave you job security. It doesn't matter if they gave you tenure. Like, they took everything. And so at that point, it's like an easy choice. You're going to get canceled eventually. Like, it's a Soviet style interrogation that they're conducting. So take the plunge, choose your own like cancellation, and go out and build something new. I don't know. Like, I have become kind of impatient about this, because I think people need to know what time it is.
Yeah. You and I have come to the same place of freedom through two different routes, perhaps.
Yeah.
And it doesn't diminish either one, because I don't feel any like I'm a superhero for what I did. It's like, but dude, I was hungry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I had kids, or have kids,
Yeah.
It's like, okay, what was your motivation, Jack? Feed my children. And it was like the
Right.
only vocation that I saw in front of me that was open to a guy like me, was this one. And lucky for me, compared to some of the other anonymous folks on Twitter, I have a rich education and work and experience and background that I can bring to this. And I've studied and worked in different fields and been very successful in different ways. But in this particular issues, on these particular matters, these are just personal things that mean the world to me. I'm pulling on the same string I started pulling on when I got divorced in 2008, pulling on the same thread. Like, how do I date? What is Tinder? Why are girls so crazy? What do you mean feminism's not good? And just keep pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling. And I'm still pulling on the same thread. And here we are having the same conversation, all the way down to figuring out and coming to an agreement that our political conflict is based on irreconcilable first principles. That's a lot of pulling on a thread just because I wanted to get laid in 2008, right? And restore my manhood, right? Like, it's interesting. I've taken so much action, and I wonder what my motivations are in times. After my divorce, this phrase I just said, restore my manhood. That was my mission. It had been stripped, or I had allowed it to have been stripped, or I had ditched it and burned it and threw it in the trash myself. I don't know how it happened, but it did. My manhood was gone. It was gone. My independence, my strength, my virility, my ability to provide, protect, and instruct, and it was gone. And I had to find how to get it back. It's been a 10-year process.
Wow.
And I started with the hedonistic stuff, right? Like, oh, let me get the six pack out. Okay, did that. All right, let's date a bunch and be promiscuous and hedonistic. And I did all that, and I achieved all of my goals. That is for sure.
Sure
That
enough.
said, it starts to ring empty, because it is empty. It is empty, and now it's transformed into finding that deeper spiritual meaning. And I believe that this path, this journey I'm on, mirrors the nation. I am a product of the nation. I'm a man of the people, and all my friends and associates are on similar journeys. And so it just feels so much more authentic. But I feel for people who are still at risk. And
Right.
this is why sovereignty is such a big deal for us in the liminal order. We want you to have financial sovereignty, political sovereignty, a mental, emotional, spiritual sovereignty, so that you can be free, so that you can express yourself, and so you can be less concerned with cancellation or ostracization. This is why we're building this network. And the network, we're at 600 guys. My goal is to take all of what I call the gross network product, like the sum total of our economic activity, and move it inside the network as much as
Mm,
possible. Not for me to monetize, but so that we are cross pollinating each other and providing circumstance in which we benefit from each other's mutual actions. And
mm,
that's the kind of sovereignty that I want for the guys so that they can feel free to speak their mind. When you don't speak your mind, it is torture. It's absolutely
yeah,
torture. It's absolutely
yeah.
torture.
No, it is. I mean, emasculating in the truest sense of the word. It sucks your soul out from your body, and you know, I think that story that you tell is so valuable because it's when 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 guys like us get up and sort of pronounce about the virtues and the and masculinity and these high ideals, right? On the one hand, I think you and I are both completely sincere about those words and unblushing about using them as ideals to aspire to. On the other hand, right, like people can hear that and kind of they give themselves an easy out because they're like, well, I'm just a kind of a regular dude, right? Like I'll just stick with the six pack on the couch or whatever. And it's like, no, like the six pack on the couch is what led Jack eventually to these high, like getting past that, realizing the emptiness of it. I think about like, and I have similar thoughts in my head sometimes about like, well, really, what are my motivations? What do I really want? Right? Do I just want this or that, or the big house or the fancy car or whatever? But then I think about like Raphael, one of the great painters of the Italian Renaissance. His biographer records that he was a total horn dog. He was a total ladies' man. And so it's like, was Raphael trying to get some tail when he painted the Stanza della Segnatura? Like, probably, like I bet that was on his mind. I bet he was thinking, but his natural inclinations led him to something higher, led him to some of the greatest art in the world. And it's like we think that the fact that we're kind of broken messes, the fact that we have all these problems that we know about that nobody else knows, we think that means that like we have a pass from aspiring to the highest ideals. It's like, no, you're going to make the highest ideals out of that broken mess that you are. Like
Mm,
nobody gets a pass.
mm. That is such a great point. First of all, we're all broken in
Oh my
some way,
gosh.
right?
Mm,
We're all
totally.
broken in some way. And that is something that I've been able to admit and accept only recently, and accept and admit without shame.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I just try, right? Like that's my goal. I just try to be better. And so
Yeah.
when I'm skimming some of these comments in the chat right now, and some of these people aren't understanding what we're talking about here.
Okay.
You and I, and we can talk about these things in the language that we talk about it, but this is the everyman task. And
Right.
and we are every man. We are broken, just like you're broken. We have flaws. Everybody has flaws, and they can simply be overcome
Oh
through
my
some
gosh.
sort of
Well,
motivation and faith and some sort of inspiration.
because you, I mean, know what's going on inside your own head. And you don't know what's going on in anybody else's head. I mean, this is one of the central insights of the gospel. That whole judge not lest ye be judged thing. It's like you have no clue. Doesn't mean that you don't, punish wrongdoing. Doesn't mean that there's no such thing as law and order. None of that is what that means. It just means that at the end of the day, the thing that God sees when he looks at that creature is something much more broken and tragic and frail than anything you could imagine. And the way that you know that is because of what's in your own head, like all the stuff that's going on in your own head. And so it's like different guys are better at presenting themselves to the world, and some guys are very polished, and some guys have figured some things out as they go along. You're an example, right, of somebody who has figured stuff out as you went along. But it doesn't change. Like you're never not broken. Like you're never not just fundamentally, like I know the stuff that goes on in my head. It's disgusting. Like, and I think everybody feels that way. And coming to terms with that, like you're describing, is so important because otherwise you project it out onto other people. Like you imagine, like you act as if your shit don't stink.
Right.
And there's so much of that out there where it's like, oh yeah, like you think I don't know that you're like a disaster inside, like you think that, like, and again, it doesn't excuse you, right? It's not like you can just be like, oh well, I'm this broken mess and therefore I don't have to do anything. Like, no, everybody is a broken mess. It's
Well,
funny how hard that is to internalize.
it's so hard to internalize. And what's interesting is maybe one of the best outcomes of that is compassion. It's like,
Yeah.
I'm broken. Oh, everybody else is probably broken too. Mm. Nope. That's not actually the progression. The progression is I'm broken. Fuck, I'm the only one that's broken. Right.
Right.
That's sort of the process. And I think a lot of people get stuck there in
Yeah.
the I'm the only one that's broken part. And call back to what you said earlier, where when you were like starting your podcast, you're like, who the fuck's going to listen to me?
Right.
Dude, same. Or, I see somebody I want to talk to and I get nervous.
Yeah.
It's like, go talk to that guy. He wants to talk. I'm like, are you sure he wants to talk to me? These things still go on in my head. You just have to, you learn how to overcome them. And one of the ways that you can learn to overcome them is by not only accepting that you're flawed, but everybody else is flawed too. Everybody else. And they're not looking at you, judging you, dude. They're sitting there thinking in their own head, like, do I look stupid today? And
Right.
and once you understand that your insides and their insides are probably pretty close, it opens up a lot more compassion. And compassion is something that we need more of: compassion for ourselves and compassion for the people around us.
Yeah, it's such a good point because when you get to talking about manhood and masculinity, there's this amazing thing, right, where the caricature that we have in our head about that is actually a caricature that feminists invented.
Mm.
Like, it was feminists who were like, oh, toxic masculinity.
Mm.
Oh, men feel like they can't cry. Oh, men never have any emotions, whatever. Men are so aggressive all the time, 100% of the time. It's like the high values of manhood, the chivalric code, right? Or the Greek warrior code, right? None of that ever came along with like, you can't have any softness, you can't have any feelings, you can't cry, right? Like Achilles wept for something like 9 days straight when Patroclus died. Like, and nobody ever dared to say like, you're not manly or whatever. And so like when you start talking about compassion, right? It's one of the things that, we don't often think about that as part of our cultivation as men, right? That we would like become more fully human and more deeply compassionate as we become more comfortable and assertive and strong. But those things go hand in hand because, of course, like as you're saying, your compassion for other people teaches you to be more confident in yourself, and your confidence in yourself allows you to be more compassionate for other people. And so these things, I mean, it's feminism that taught us that those things are somehow separate from one another. The reality the traditional reality is that they're very, very closely bound up with one another.
I find it very troubling when people say men shouldn't, can't, or don't have emotions, or that you should not pay attention to them or whatnot. I find my emotions to be one of the most accurate sense making tools that I have. And
Right.
I tend to trust my emotions more now than I ever did before. I was disconnected from the confidence in my emotions to trust them, right? To say, oh, I'm having a negative feeling about the circumstance. Maybe the circumstance is negative. I don't know why. I'm feeling it. I should just trust it. Or I'm sad, or I'm joyous, or whatever it is. To fully experience your emotions is to be male. Now, to be consumed by your emotions is not. And to
Right.
allow those emotions to control your life and take you down negative paths, definitely not. But there's nothing masculine about stifling your emotions or disregarding them, I don't think. I think that they're very powerful signals. And I got a very powerful signal early on in this conversation. I don't know if you noticed it. When you said that it was something like God's plan isn't a plan where Jack's already got it all figured out and he's not just waiting for me on that path, that he's actually here on this path with me where I'm trying to figure it out right now. My eyes swelled up, dude, and I had to fight back a tear because it really it really resonated with me. And that is a signal to me that this is something I should really look at and examine.
Mm.
And if I
Right.
had been taught to disregard my emotions, maybe I wouldn't have seen that very clear signal of resonance.
Mm.
So I
That's so
appreciate
interesting.
that, Spencer. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. You know, it's so funny. Like there are these things that just catch you in your throat suddenly, right? And as you say, that's information. It's not like you should therefore like, you know, break apart your entire, like that's not the thing that you do where every time you have that feeling you change your entire way of life, like Jack's now canceling the liminal order or whatever. Like, you know, that's not how you do it. But right, I mean, like these things are tender, dare I say, right? I mean, because we're so broken, because we have so much even unexamined, unacknowledged shame about our brokenness. And Eve, part of the fall, I think, is we have this glitch in our brain where like we can't get out of that mode of thinking. We can't get out of, I need to do this, this, and this in order to be ready to approach God. It's like, dude, you couldn't even have the thought to approach God if God weren't already closer than your jugular vein. Like you couldn't even begin to like have that idea. And so if that's true, and if God is like so intimately bound up with you that you don't even know where he ends and you begin, and you're what you are, you're the sniveling, broken, sad little guy that you know yourself to be, that's an entire paradigm shift. That's like everything, you know, for God's love for us was shown to us in this, that while we were still sinners, like, you know, that's like Paul wasn't kidding about that. Like he was a murderous, scheming, angry little man when God came to him, and he was very open about it. Anyway, I mean, yes, and the profundity of that, and like the letting your emotions have a say in that, I think, is so important, not just for the masculinity conversation, but for the other one we were having about like reason. How do you think? What do you actually know about the world? Well, one of the things you know is your experience of it, right? And like something like beauty, something like when a sunset hits you and you get that catch in your throat again, right? That can't be reasoned away, even though it's nowhere in the atoms. Like the atoms of the light refracting through the air are not what you're experiencing when you experience that beauty. And like, so these things are givens. You have to reason with them. You have to know that they're there, because otherwise you just like, there's nothing essentially.
I have cried far more tears of joy than sorrow.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. And I appreciate you, Spencer. And I appreciate this conversation, man. This has been freaking fantastic. It was everything that I was hoping it would be, sir. It's been a pleasure to make your acquaintance. I look forward very much to coming to Nashville and sitting down with you in person. I hope that this is an ongoing conversation and the beginning of a long relationship. I think that we are on similar paths with similar goals, and I think that we should be working together and trying to, you know, make the world into a better place, my brother.
Likewise, buddy. And I would say, as the kids say, co-sign to all of that. I appreciate this very much, my friend. And I will talk to you again very soon, I'm sure.
Fantastic, guys. This is Spencer Klavan at Young Heretics, the associate editor of American Mind. I'm Jack Murphy. Give us a follow, give us a sub, share this thing so that other people can enjoy and appreciate what we just went through. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Guys, we'll be back next week. And until then, we are out. On this show, we're driven by curiosity. We want to chart a path forward. Best people, best conversations. We're on a journey and it's just getting started.